Welcome back to Service and Beyond podcast. This is part 3 of our 3-part series on Boeing veterans and the Boeing Veterans Working Group. For this episode, it was my privilege to speak with a champion of our servicemen and women and of veterans' causes, and that's the leader of the Boeing company in the region, Dr. Brendan Nelson. Dr. Nelson commenced his career as a medical doctor in Tasmania before moving on to public life and senior leadership roles. Here he served as Minister for Defence from 2006 to 2007, leader of the federal opposition, and Australian ambassador to NATO and the European Union. In his last role before joining Boeing, Dr. Nelson served 7 years as director of the Australian War Memorial. This episode was recorded in November 2021. Brendan, welcome to Service and Beyond.
Thank you very much, Matt. There's only one special person on this podcast, and that's you. So thank you.
So kind of you to say. It's great for you to take the time out to talk about the veterans' causes and the veterans' roles and involvement with the Boeing company over the last few years. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a privilege, especially to speak about this topic.
And you've been obviously in New South Wales for much of the COVID lockdown, and things are starting to emerge for the better down there.
Yes, I have. Obviously, as a people, as Australians, we're traumatised in many ways. When you think over the last few years, we lived through crippling drought, devastating bushfires, floods, hailstorms in some parts of the country, and then a once-in-a-century global pandemic with all of the health, human, social and economic consequences. It's been a stop-start for us in New South Wales. For periods I was able to travel to other parts of Australia, and then in others we had an extended lockdown here. Of course, nothing as difficult as the people of Victoria have faced. And then, of course, we see, Matt, the splintering of our country in many ways, of the Federation, with Western Australia essentially closed off the rest of Australia, and to varying degrees South Australia, Tasmania and Queensland. So very challenging. I had the fortune, and bizarrely, I could go to the United States. I went to the US for work for 4 weeks in September, and then spent 2 weeks in a hotel room not being able to open a window. But I couldn't travel to Perth or Brisbane at the time. So obviously, I have nothing to complain about whatsoever, but it's just a reflection of the impact of all this on so many of us. And the most dramatic of which has been my mother died in May, and I had to watch her funeral service on a webcam, on a live stream, and along with so many other Australians who've had those sort of experiences. So it's been a tough time for us all.
Yeah, it has, and the border shutdowns really have affected, my wife in particular, with her family being down in Sydney, and her not getting the chance to visit since April, May this year, and of course last year before that. So it's been quite a trying period.
Yeah, and we're all, to varying degrees, we all have our resilience, but it's interesting the cumulative nature of these events, some of which I just mentioned at a national level, and then at a personal level, and you don't realise the impact they're having on you at the time. And I've certainly found that a lot of people with whom I work, when you open up yourself, I think you have to speak about your own experiences. And I find when I do so, you open up, you expose your own vulnerability to some extent. I found amongst our own workforce, let alone friends, quite significant and negative impacts of what they've had to endure.
I think sometimes they're the hidden impacts that aren't quite represented in the numbers and the tallies that get represented each week and each day by our state leaders. They're just those, if you like, the latent risks and the latent impacts on people that do build up.
Yeah, that's true, Matt. Our governments have been basically putting railway tracks in front of the train. They've had to deal with something for which there's really been no rule book. And generally speaking, our country has managed it very well. There's obviously been some missteps and things that have not gone according to plan, and things that in hindsight I'm sure our governments would do differently. But it has been an extraordinarily challenging time, and this has and will change us. The world has changed, we have changed, and we're now going through the phase of progressively moving into what is described as the COVID normal world, where COVID is a part of our society. It's one of those things which could cause serious illness, if not death. You'll just add it to the other things in life, from car crashes to a heart attack. But it's changed us, and the extent to which it has, we'll only really fully appreciate with the passage of time.
And Brandon, your experience with defence, you've obviously had significant experience stemming back really from my time in defence, back when you were Minister for Defence from 1996. So the last 15 years, you've had a lot of contact with defence and the Veterans Cause, in fact, across your directorship of the War Memorial and, of course, your role as ambassador in Europe. And you're also a keen student of history, of military history, that is.
Well, I wouldn't profess to be an expert on military history, but I'm very interested in it, and I've learned a lot about it. And look, so by way of context, my great-grandfather on my mother's side was in the 12th Battalion in the Gallipoli Landing. He was Tasmanian, enlistment number 24. He survived Gallipoli, then ended up in the Middle East in one squadron in the Australian Flying Corps. He was a mechanic. And he had 6 sons and 2 daughters. All 6 of those sons, one of whom was my grandfather, served in the Second World War, and the 2 daughters were in the Australian Lands Army. So I grew up in an environment where I was surrounded by the pictures, the military hats, and in the case of 2 of my grandfather's brothers, the lived traumas of having lived through service. So the architecture of my growing up, without realising at the time, was this notion of service and military service in particular. And then I was Parliamentary Secretary for Defence, so the junior minister in 2001, in which I was responsible for the defence estate, the properties, cadets, emergency management, defence IT, and a whole range of things like that. And I loved it. To be honest with you, it was the most enjoyable job that I had in politics. I was the junior minister, and I didn't have to front question time and answer questions. But then in January 2006, after 4.5 years as Education, Science and Training Minister, John Howard called me and asked me if I would move to Defence. And I did that for 2 years until we lost office. But to this day, it is the hardest job I have ever had. But it also was, I've enjoyed everything I've done, but I think it was also the most satisfying. And I've always been proud to be an Australian, but it was those 2 years in particular that really changed my perspective on what is really important in life and why it's important. And then, as you say, I was gobsmacked when Kevin Rudd asked me if I would go to Brussels as our ambassador to the European Union, Belgium and Luxembourg, but it was NATO that particularly attracted me to it. I didn't see myself in the gin and tonic set being a diplomat. If my own party had been in office, I would have sought a diplomatic posting. But when that came up, we were in a NATO-led war. We had virtually no relationship with NATO. And Kevin Rudd said, I need someone that can bang down those doors and get us to the table and give us influence at NATO. And I thought, well, here's another way of serving the troops. So yeah, that was a wonderful experience. And then, of course, the privilege, which is what it is, privilege of being the director of the Australian War Memorial for 7 years. I loved every day of that job.
And of course, the defence landscape's changed quite immeasurably, really, over that 15-year period from 2006 through to the current day. I think 2006, we were just starting out in Iraq. The Afghanistan campaign was ongoing. We were in Timor. And now, of course, the landscape developed significantly with things including the bushfires last year, which was the first compulsory call out of ADF reservists, and even COVID-19, not to mention the security challenges in the region.
Yes, it has changed enormously. And in fact, when I came into Defence, we had 10 deployments. 4 of them were large. And as you say, Afghanistan, Iraq, East Timor, and the Solomon Islands. And obviously our focus is always our borders, our region, defending and protecting our interests and values. But we were heavily committed in that post 9/11 world in Central Southern Asia and the Middle East. Firstly, because our national interests were at stake, but also because of our alliance with the United States. And then when you think about how the world has changed and how what defence does now has changed since then, you get a sense of just how significant it all is. Also, the way in which defence operates, the way in which defence purchases equipment, the amount of money being spent on defence, the strategic threats, and the quite significant and rapidly changing geopolitical realignment in our region. Again, obviously, some people argue with good reason that drought and fires and floods and the frequency and scale of these environmental events are a consequence of climate change. But irrespective of the cause of them, our military is being deployed increasingly into these civilian operations. And I was only thinking yesterday, the then commanding officer of HMAS Chills, when it went to Victoria to rescue those Australians who were stranded from the fires. I remember him saying it was the most rewarding thing he'd done in his entire naval career.
It's funny that serving the people directly and being in the nation and seeing their faces in that sort of situation has that direct feedback and that direct payoff, if you like, for veterans or those serving.
Yeah. And look, you've seen it, Matt, yourself. In fact, the podcasts are often dealing with these sort of issues. But I'm much older than you, of course. I'm 63. And I remember in that period of the 1970s and the 1980s, there were serious existential questions about the future of ANZAC Day. I have an editorial from the Australian and Age newspapers, respectively, from 1974 that seriously questioned the future of ANZAC Day. And we lived in a country then where people falsely conflated commemoration with celebration of war, which is complete madness. And in part, that came out of the Vietnam War. But over the last 20 years, in my opinion, what's happened is there's been a breakdown of the God, King and Country framework within which my generation and those before me basically lived. And younger people are increasingly looking for and finding meaning in what it means to be Australian, in the values that they perceive are in and they find represented by the uniform of our three services. And one of the reasons I think why there has been growing respect for men and women who wear our uniform and those who have is because they have seen Australians going off into peacekeeping operations, humanitarian disaster relief in our region, but also in our own country. And I think that has, and look, I went through 2 weeks of hotel quarantine recently for reasons I described earlier. And I got off the bus at the Radisson Blu Hotel where they were taking us in the Sydney CBD. And there were 8 or 9 military men and women in uniform from the three services. And I said to this young fella from the Navy, I said, mate, would I be right in thinking that when you joined the Navy, you were not thinking the pinnacle of your career would be carrying my suitcases into the Radisson Blu Hotel? he laughed and he said, well, you're absolutely right about that, sir. And I said, well, yes, I know there'll be better things ahead for you, but this means a lot to Australians, what you're doing. And the others all agreed with that, of course.
Yeah, it's uncanny the challenges that are on the horizon for the Defence Force in the coming years. But of course, defence industry has a major role to play. And to tell you the truth, during my service career as a pilot in Navy and Air Force, I was mostly paying attention to companies like Boeing for the sort of products and aircraft they provided. I was always looking for the next platform coming through, one of which was a C-17, which I was lucky enough to fly for 4 years with the Air Force. But defence industry has done a lot more to contribute to the defence cause, and now they're being seen as a fundamental input to capability, so a real pillar in the defence of the nation.
Absolutely. In fact, that was I think my first decision when I was Defence Minister was to buy C-17s, and even then in 2006, I remember addressing industry conferences, defence industry, and saying that industry should regard itself as much a part of Australia's defence capability as those who are actually in uniform. And today it's much, much closer. In fact, there are more Australians employed in defence industry now than there are actually those in uniform. But as you and I know, Matt, and you're one of them, within our own company, Boeing, about a quarter of our Boeing Defence Australia employees are veterans, and many of them continue to be reservists. And what defence has evolved into now is seeing what we in the defence industry sector do as being a platform or a capability steward, where we're very much regarded equally, pretty much equally with defence in terms of being a part of the nation's defence capability. And if you look at the model, of course, with ATS, the Loyal Wingman, which is literally a co-investment between Boeing and the Royal Australian Air Force. And only yesterday I was having a meeting with Glenn Ferguson, who heads our ATS program. And of course, we've got a Royal Australian Air Force officer now embedded with the team. So that's how it works. And one of the things that we're obviously increasingly looking at is how we can have uniformed people seamlessly come into a company like Boeing, or whether it's Thales or Lockheed Martin, Northrop, whoever it is, and then seamlessly go back into the uniform side of service. And equally, our people, say people like yourself, going into Air Force for a period of time and then coming back. We've got to increasingly regard ourselves as very, very much a part of the nation's capability, fully interoperable, and within reason, employees being readily exchangeable.
And you touched on briefly the Boeing Airpower Teaming System, or the Loyal Wingman, which of course is an uncrewed vehicle. The first military aircraft, I should say, developed in Australia in the last 50 years, and rapidly developed in about 3 years from prototype, or I should say through to digital design, through to flying prototype, which is just extraordinary in terms of meeting the challenges that are coming up.
It is, and it is a great credit to, firstly, Boeing, Vanderworks International, BR&T, the investment made by Boeing in Australia in resin-infused composite manufacturing, having the courage to invest in the development of the idea, and then the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian government co-investing. So instead of the traditional model of defence having a shopping list of things it wants to buy, of us, in this case Boeing, talking to government and Air Force and saying, look, we've got an idea for a capability. We think this might be something of value to the Royal Australian Air Force. Why don't we work together and co-invest in this idea to development? Now, traditionally, of course, government, with taxpayers' dollars, is very risk averse, very hesitant to go into some sort of developmental project which may not work, and so on and so forth. But to its credit, and Defence Minister Christopher Pyne at the time in 2017 was very supportive of the then government doing this. And when you think that we've been able to, from conception to development, design, manufacture to flight, in just over 3 years, that is really extraordinary. And an SME supply chain of 35 Australian businesses, 70% of the value of the aircraft is Australian made. That is quite a significant achievement. And we've had subsequent flight, of course, of the aircraft, and it's produced for an export market. So that's probably I think that's an exemplar of what can be done. And I also think, Matt, it's the model that increasingly we're going to see defence needing to pursue, because the long lead times, if you look at the risk and the threat environment, we can't afford to wait 10, 15, 20 years for key capabilities. We need to be as efficient as we can as getting them to the marketplace.
I suppose that supports the idea also of this flexibility and the ability of Boeing employees to move back to defence, and defence personnel to move into the company and so forth. And I know a range of my colleagues, some work as test pilots in the ATS program, some work as flying instructors on the helicopter school in Nowra, where I trained for the Navy, and some are flying out on Chinooks as flying instructors. So there is that flexibility built in, and that's an increasing focus.
Well, you don't need me to tell you this, of course, but the flexibility is also important because it's sensible business. I mean, if we want to keep highly trained, skilled men and women in our workforce at Boeing, then we need to give them the opportunities and encourage them to have the opportunities to seamlessly transfer across to defence and back. it's plain common sense. And interestingly, with the recent following the collapse of Kabul and the airlift that was done by our C-17s and Royal Australian Air Force, we had Boeing personnel, our employees, that were stepping up easily into roles, seamlessly, in fact, into roles that would normally be done by uniform RAF personnel. So it worked extremely well, and that's just one example of the things that we do.
And that, of course, goes to the shared sort of skill sets, the culture, and the values of the company. I know when I hosted a session earlier this year for the Air Force's centenary, and I was just really surprised and pleased to hear a lot of stories about the purpose that flows across from defence service into Boeing service and the similarities between the cultures.
Well, they are, and it's people like you that make the cultures very similar, because the more people that we have, men and women who work for Boeing, who come from the military, then understandably the culture from which you all come informs the Boeing culture, and vice versa. I certainly have observed over the last 15 years that men and women in uniform are now more sensitive to and attuned to the requirements of business and industry, whereas like 20 years ago, it was industry and defence itself was speaking completely different language. Now it's much more compatible.
So there's a lot of senior leaders within the company, some within Boeing Defence Australia, some within other branches that have that defence background. Do you think there's something in particular that it views or brings to the leadership culture of people within the company?
Well, in my opinion, anyone who has worn the uniform of our three services is going to be an asset to any business that he or she goes to, whether that's in defence industry or whether it's in a completely different field of endeavour. And the reason I say that is because people that have gone through the military, whether as officers or other ranks, whether it's Navy, Army or Air Force, there are certain things that are consistent to the experiences those people have and what they bring to your business. Some of them are well known to us in terms of discipline, teamwork, curiosity, problem solving, a willingness to put themselves out there, to be prepared to take risks, not cavalier risks, but ones that are measured. People that know the importance of turning up on time, of working hard, all of that and more. But they're resourceful people generally. Also, as I say, curious. People that generally will devote themselves to the cause that they've chosen to take up. There's a sense of caring for one another and for other people. So I think defence personnel, veterans, are an immense asset. And one of the things that concerns me is we're now thankfully more attuned to its traumas, post-traumatic stress and other things that veterans who've seen operational service can bring back to Australia with them. And well, I think one of the things that concerns me, though, is a lot of employers, because we're now much more open in discussing these issues, unfortunately, a lot of employers have a false idea that don't employ a veteran because there might be a problem. And so we've just got to make sure we get that balance right.
Yeah, indeed. And it really is encouraging to see a lot of the work being done by ex-service organisations and other champions in the veteran space. And of course, there's the Royal Commission coming up next year to get to the bottom of some of the suicides and concerns that have been happening. So it's really encouraging time, I think, for a lot of focus, yes, and perhaps spotlight on the issues, but also resources being poured into it to ultimately find solutions.
My view of it is that every man and woman who wears a uniform that deploys into an operational environment, and it's not just war. I think what those Australians endured in Somalia and Rwanda was worse than many wars. Some of the experiences that Australian defence personnel had after the Bali bombings or the Indian Ocean tsunami were extremely confronting and damaging to them. Some of them, not all. And so I think we need to be, and we are alert to this, but we also need to recognise that what I was going to say is that I think that everybody is affected. You know, all of us, we are a product of layers and layers of experience that we have go through our lives. And I think that all defence personnel are affected by the experiences that they have. It's only a matter of degree, and there are some points on the spectrum of impact where it becomes a problem. And but what employers, and I often say to people who are unfamiliar with defence and defence personnel, what I often say to them is, look, people live with post-traumatic stress in the same way they live with diabetes or epilepsy. It's just one of the features of you. It doesn't make you a less valuable employee, or in fact, in some cases, make an even better one. So I think that's the kind of messaging that we need to be projecting. And as you well know, at Boeing, we work really hard to make sure that we get as many veterans on board as we can.
We do indeed, and we're actually quite active in supporting other causes, including the Prime Minister's Veterans Awards, which occur each year. They've been ongoing, I think, since 2016. I think we're the silver sponsor there, and just looking at the last winners from this year, in fact, all three of the employer awards went to defence-owned businesses, or defence industry businesses, I should say, from big through to small. So really encouraging there to see a lot of small enterprises led by veterans also being awarded.
Oh, it is. And I've been patron of the Reserve, an ambassador for the Reserve Forces Council for nearly a decade, and I never cease to be amazed. You've got the big companies that are obviously supporting reservists like us, Commonwealth Bank, and those sort of things. But what never ceases to amaze me are the small businesses that might employ 8 or 9 people, and or even less, and they're actively supporting reservists and so on, but they're also actively doing what they can to recruit and employ veterans and support them if they are having any issues. Just remarkable people.
That's one thing that's really encouraged me, actually, to tell you the truth, on leaving and starting the podcast, just touching base with small companies like With You, With Me, Bench On, TACMed, and seeing them really, I guess, run with the cause, not leave behind defence and behind the interests of veterans, but actually take them up and apply a personal touch. And that's one of the things that's motivated me really to start the podcast and focus efforts here. It's really great to see.
Well, it sounds terribly patronising, but we're very proud of you, Matt. Not just the work you do for the company, but what you're doing here with the podcast. I know it's got a significant and growing audience. It's interesting. You're drawing out the issues about which people are concerned. The conversations are frank and meaningful. And if people don't tell you, you're having an immensely positive and constructive impact on a whole lot of people. So, bloody good job, mate.
Oh, thank you very much. It's just nice for me to contribute to, I think, what a lot of people are doing, and what is really a groundswell, I think, of support for the growing veteran base. So, my pleasure. Brendan, I think lastly to wrap up, I'm wondering what lies ahead for you. You've had a illustrious career, roles at the highest levels of leadership in this country. Now, of course, heading up Boeing in the region and in this country. Where do you see yourself in a couple of years?
Well, when I left school, I didn't know what to do, but I was good at economics, so I started an economics degree. I dropped out of that after a year. I spent a year working in a department store and weekends in a pub, and I decided to do medicine. Pretty much every year of my working life, someone has asked me what I'm going to do next year or the year after. And pretty much every time I've been asked that question, I've said, I don't know. And I'd like to think that in a couple of years' time, I would still have the privilege to be the chairman and country vice president of Boeing for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. But I've always said to young people, you concentrate on the job you've got, and the next one will look after itself. So I just want to do the best I can for Boeing and our employees, the men and women with whom we work in Australia, to see that we deliver our products and services, and we develop new ones and new ideas, and that we continue to be a part of not just the industrial and employment framework of Australia, but a key part of Australia's defence capability. I also do, I don't take any money for them, but I'm also chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. And the Chamber is a critically important part of the Australia-United States alliance. And I regard that as a really important activity. I'm also on the board of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which obviously is the independent think tank that looks at defence and strategic policy for Australia, and I'm a director of the United States Study Centre. So, and then I've got 9 charities which I'm patron. So pretty busy. But whatever I do, Matt, I'd like to think that I'll be making a difference and a positive difference to the lives of other people.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. I'd just like to say thank you for taking time out today. Your busy schedule obviously continues, so thanks for taking time out and for your leadership across the years, both at a very senior level in government, in diplomacy, and now with the Boeing Company, and the work you've done for veterans. So thank you so much.
It's all been a privilege, Matt. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Brent.